Hey there, Quack 12 fans and new Big Ten listeners to the Quack 12 podcast. Normally silly Oregon Ducks podcast, but today, with the help of Hythloday of Addicted to Quack and Trent Condon of Locked on Iowa, we kick off our 18-part series, that is right, 18 parts, covering this new conference of ours, the Big Ten. Now, this is part one of that, obviously, and we're starting with the surest roster there is, that is the Iowa roster. We are covering every Big Ten team's entire roster, so be sure to stay locked into this podcast, and also stay tuned into Locked on Iowa, and follow them at Locked on Iowa, because that is, of course, where you can find the work of Trent Condon, our guest today, at Trent Condon on Twitter. And then there's, of course, the man who chooses to watch Iowa offense for fun, Hythloday of Addicted to Quack. Now, since we've recorded this episode, QB Deacon Hill and tight end Cale Vanderbush have actually hit the transfer portal. But other than that, this is up to date and accurate, knock on wood. I mean, it's going to take me a little while to post it, so you never know. That being said, with no further ado, except for a moment to plug that if you like what you hear, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. But now, with no further ado, let's get to this great interview with Trent Condon.
Welcome to the Quack 12 podcast, the most official, unofficial Oregon Ducks podcast on the web footosphere. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Quack12Podcast or visit our website, quack12podcast.com. If you like what you hear, please leave us 5 stars on your listening device. And if you'd like to support the show, please visit the Quack 12 Patreon page, where for a measly $5 a month, you can become an official Quacky and unlock hundreds of hours of Oregon Duck content. On to the show. Quack, quack.
Okay, Trenton, let's jump right in with probably the biggest change, which is overall offensive coordinator is changing. Brian Ferentz is out and Tim Lester is in. Tim Lester was the offensive coordinator, the head coach at Western Michigan for 6 years after PJ Fleck took over at Minnesota. And then the last year, I think he was an analyst in the NFL. What differences are you expecting for the offense under Tim Lester?
I think it's going to be pretty significant, at least for Iowa standards. And, that's a thing that's been a big conversation piece going back to when the change was announced during the middle of the season after the Minnesota game, where at the time, interim athletic director, Beth Getz, she said that his contract was not going to be renewed and that they were going to move on after the season. It created a lot of angst, a lot of frustration. Certainly, I know with Kirk Ferentz, his son, Brian being let go, doing it in season, I know was kind of a difficult situation, something that they didn't want to have to deal with, but there they were. And then it took a long time for them to get an offensive coordinator. It was one of those, well, we're going to wait until after we get through the bowl season. And the bowl game didn't go very well after the Big Ten championship game lost to Michigan. And a lot of people were upset about that. And when it was Tim Lester, it was for me initially kind of a ho-hum, a guy that knew about his time. He was a quarterback at Western Michigan when Iowa played them. And we knew a little bit about his background, but it was just maybe concern about more of the same. But as soon as he's been on the job, he has certainly said the right things. And after getting a chance to see it for the first time Saturday in the open spring practice, it does look like there's going to be real change. And you go through now the 4 different offensive coordinators for Kirk Ferentz. There are basic tenets of the Iowa system and the way that they're going to play. but this is going to look a lot different. And the biggest part about that is there's going to be a lot more motion, a lot more pre-shift, pre-snap motion that you're going to see out of this offense. And that is a welcome change from the Brian Ferentz system that was dead on arrival, just absolutely terrible and really cratered the last couple of seasons. So you're going to see a different look for Iowa. They're still going to run the football, but you're going to see a lot more RPOs. You're going to see a lot more motion before the snap. And those are things that definitely need to happen. They're not going to be out there running 90, 100 plays a game. That's not going to be certainly the pace that they play at, but it's going to be, you hope at least, well, it can't be worse. It's it's got to be better than what it's been the last 2 years.
Yeah, I did manage to get my hands on the Iowa spring game. I did notice, a lot more motion, pre-snap motion. You're definitely right about that. Well, it's difficult to tease out the RPO effect, especially because the way that you install a more RPO heavy offense it usually comes later in the installation. Like I wouldn't really be surprised if we didn't see the full flower of that until fall camp. So like I didn't pick up much of that in the spring game, but that didn't surprise me. The thing that in terms of opening up the offense or it being like radically different that I'm sort of skeptical of is it's still very much a 12 personnel offense. And I think in terms of the personnel, it's tons of tight ends on the field at any given time and not really leveraging the wide receivers nor was there a concerted effort to bring in more wide receivers to sort of open up, hey, let's run this out of 11, or let's see if we could have more empty or really open up the pass game. Like it really, I don't want to say like exactly it's more of the same, but I think it's sort of like a new spin at most on the same personnel groups rather than it's going to be new personnel groups. Do you think I've got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's Iowa playing to their strengths. Like wide receiver recruiting has not been good. You couple that with the departures that they've had. Just one scholarship wide receiver has made it through 4 years over the last 5 seasons. That shows you just how difficult it has been to maintain wide receivers and what Iowa can get. And as you see, as you flip on basically NFL game, you'll see an Iowa tight end out there playing, and that's their strength. So it makes sense for them in the way they're built and the way they recruit to have more tight ends on the field and to play that kind of fashion, but to be able to do it in a way that makes sense and find a way to actually take shots down the field and not have everything so compressed close to the line of scrimmage. And that's been a problem for them. And it just got worse and worse over the last couple of seasons, is where you don't have motion, you don't have a whole lot of guessing of where the ball is going to go. And when everything is compressed down, it makes it incredibly easy on the linebackers, on the tight ends. Even one thing that was a huge tenet of the Iowa offense was the outside zone play. Well, that's dead. With the blocking rules now in place in college football, you can't run outside zone, certainly the way that you can't. You can't block the back end. You can't cut block. And because of that, that play, which was a huge part of the Iowa offense, has been dead on arrival. And Kirk Ferentz, his unwillingness for so long to go away from that, led to some of the problems we've seen over the last couple of seasons. But that's kind of the thought process behind it. Look, you're not going to get dynamic wide receivers right now that are going to want to play in the Iowa offense. It's an incredibly difficult sell for anyone. So play to your strengths and have multiple tight ends on the field.
Well, and then the other thing is, we were talking a little bit about this off air, is that Iowa is a remarkably stable roster. And one of the big part of that is just 2024 happens to be a year in which there are simply not that many departures. Different years, there are more departures than others. 2024 is relatively light on that question. But the other thing, just sort of structurally, seems to be the case under Coach Ferentz is, boy, this is a team that just does not play in the portal. Very, very few guys they bring in. I mean, there are a couple exceptions here and there, and we're going to talk about a couple of the more prominent ones to start out with when we get to the individual positions. And then the other thing is they don't really – I cannot detect this team uses the portal to sort of process guys out at all. And so there's very little roster churn. Like even if they wanted to like transform their offense or their defense, I don't know why they would, because it's a great defense, but if theoretically, if they wanted to like transform something about their team, they couldn't do so with the modern roster management tools of using the transfer portal to turn over your roster quickly. They're like the anti-Colorado, where they could push everybody out the door and bring in a bunch of new folks. They're like whatever the opposite of Deion Sanders is, that's Kirk Ferentz in more ways than one. And I'll talk about it when I get to a couple different position groups where I think there are guys on this roster who I kind of doubt they're ever going to see the field. And I think there are other coaches out there in college football who would kind of be nudging them to the transfer portal. And I don't think that happens at Iowa. And it means that they don't have exactly the cap space. And in fact, I think they're over right now. I think you mentioned that when we were talking off air. They don't have the cap space to just grab onto a bunch of dudes and say, okay, we need more wide receivers to open up this offense. Like, I don't think they even have that ability, even if they wanted to. Have I said anything you disagree with there?
Well, there is, the thought process. Kirk Ferentz, old school guy, he's not in the portal. Well, 2 seasons ago, they did bring in 8 guys. They brought in, obviously, Cade McNamara, the headliner, Deacon Hill, the backup quarterback who had to play last season. They brought in Caleb Brown from Ohio State. He turned into be their best wide receiver. They brought in Nick Jackson from Virginia. He was a starting linebacker for them. Eric All also came in from Michigan. So they brought in 8 players a year ago. More than anything, this year, it was just a numbers game, and they're at 89 scholarships right now. They're obviously over the limit because of that. And this season, I think they would have been much more active in the portal, but they brought back 7 different guys for either their 5th or 6th season. Guys that definitely would have had a shot at minimum of being in NFL camps. 3 of those guys would have been drafted, I think, 3rd, 4th, 5th round, something like that. So that's kind of where they used, I guess, their NIL money to bring those guys back for another season, as opposed to hit the portal like they did the year before.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is the reason why we're starting out my preview series. We're doing all 18 of the Big Ten teams with Iowa. Is that, I mean, this is just going to be a super stable roster. Like I'm very confident in saying that this roster that we're looking at on April 22nd is going to be pretty much identical to the roster that we're going to see on opening day in September. Do you disagree? I mean, other than like you said, they got to lose like 4 guys, but I think we can have a pretty good guess of like who those 4 are going to be. And I don't think it's going to be like really affect anything.
They have 3 really neat areas right now, and probably 2 more than anything. They have to find a backup quarterback.
Well, yeah.
After what we saw from Deacon Hill a year ago, he's just not good enough. He just isn't.
Yeah.
Freshman that played a little bit at the end of the bowl game against Tennessee, Marco Lainez, very good athlete, good runner, can't throw the football worth a lick. And in the Iowa system, obviously that's not going to work either. So they have to find a backup quarterback. They were involved, speaking of Oregon, with Ty Thompson. Something weird happened there very quickly. He changed his commitment right before he was getting ready to make an official visit to Iowa City, and he committed to Tulane. I would anticipate that was probably he didn't get, maybe the guarantee he was looking for to compete with McNamara for the starting job. But that's the kind of quarterback they're looking for, somebody with multi-years of eligibility, be the backup for this season behind McNamara. And with the injury concerns with McNamara, that's also paramount too. So quarterback and definitely wide receiver. They have a pretty good kid that started his career at Houston. That was at Missouri State this past season. Small guy, dynamic speed though, 5'9" guy that's coming in on an official visit. So backup quarterback and a wide receiver or 2, I think are definitely the need areas. But because of the scholarships, it's not going to be many here over the next 8 days.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll keep an eye on fall camp if I wind up having to eat my words. But if I had to put money down, which I'm not going to, but I kind of think this is what we're going to be seeing in September. All right, let's start talking about the individual units. We'll start with the quarterbacks. As you say, I think their plan is to play Cade McNamara. He just hasn't been available. Let's see if I can get his history correct. He went to Michigan. He was the backup to Joe Milton in 2020. He became the starter in 2021. His NCAA passer rating was about 140, which is like perfectly FBS median. JJ McCarthy was his backup in that year. And then in 2022, Coach Harbaugh was like, let's have an open competition between you 2 guys. That was interesting because they had like a really soft non-conference in 2022. And I'll be honest, I watched that film. McCarthy was just outplaying McNamara. And then in the 3rd game against Connecticut, McNamara gets hurt. And then he has to miss some time. But I don't think it was a season-ending injury. Like, I think he could have come back and played. It's just that JJ McCarthy had like locked it down. He had that job for the rest, until he won a national championship this last year. And so Cade McNamara transfers out. He goes to Iowa for the 2023 season. He becomes the starter because of course he does. He plays for 5 games, and then in week 5 against Michigan State, it's a play they're like backed up against their goal line. He starts to scramble, and then he blows out his knee. He's like trying to juke somebody. God, it was so gruesome. Like, I had that tape in 4K, and like I watched his knee explode in glorious detail. It was just like, why did I watch this? So that one really was a season ender, and so obviously he misses the rest of the season. He is now he should be available to play in 2024, but he was not healthy enough to play in the spring game. So I still haven't seen him. But, my understanding, having watched, Deacon Hill play, you don't want to play him. I agree about Lainez. I mean, frankly, I thought he threw the ball better than Hill, but that ain't saying anything. And other quarterback, Joe Labus has transferred out. The only other scholarship quarterback in the room is a true freshman who I don't think has arrived on campus yet, James Resar. So, I mean, that's it, man. I think McNamara is the only guy who can throw the ball. And it's like a cross your fingers that he's healthy in September, let alone is healthy for the rest of the year, because he hasn't demonstrated that he can do that, nor has he demonstrated that he can do anything more than be an average quarterback. Although, frankly, being an average quarterback for Iowa would be a massive improvement. So, yes, all right, yes. I've been talking for a while. Have I said anything wrong?
No, I think you have it right on. One thing also to remember with McNamara, you mentioned the ACL tear in the Michigan State game. He got hurt in the open practice. They have one open practice during August camp. They call it Kids Day. And he sustained an injury during that day where he hurt his quad. And it was a very significant injury. I was told leading up to game week and week one this past season that it was about 50-50 if he was even going to be able to play. He was incredibly limited. He wasn't able to run at all. He's not a great runner, but I mean, he's mobile enough. He can tuck it and pick up a first down, those kind of things.
It's not a total statue or anything.
No. And they couldn't even, and quarterback sneak is something that Iowa loves to do on 3rd and 4th and 1. They couldn't even do that because he could not get the push with that quad injury a season ago. So what we saw from him in the first 4+ games a season ago wasn't a healthy Cade McNamara. So I guess that's a part of maybe the hope that a healthy Cade McNamara, but he's still got to get there. There were a couple of shots of him during the open practice over the weekend on Saturday that, he was just kind of going through a couple of drills, doing some things, and he looked incredibly gimpy. I mean, for a guy this far removed from an ACL tear, he looked bad. And it was just a couple of cuts, and you don't know exactly. He was taking, some snaps during practice before the bowl game, and he looked better than he did here. Maybe it was just that, a couple of things where he's just kind of limping around, but that's a huge concern there because a healthy Cade McNamara is something that Iowa fans haven't seen yet. You mentioned the injury at Michigan. He decided to have the surgery when there was no coming back, and it was J.J. McCarthy's job. He could have stuck it out and waited till after the season for the surgery, but he knew he was on his way out the door, so he got it as early as possible. But you're talking about damaged goods, and that's a huge concern about this position. You mentioned James Resar, really fast kid, Florida State champion in a couple of different events. He's got speed. The concern with him is also the throwing ability, kind of like we talked about with Lainez there. So there just isn't a quarterback that you can be comfortable with on this roster outside of McNamara. And from what I saw from him in the open practice, it's going to take a lot of work for him to be ready to go 100% by September.
But we didn't have any indication during 2021 when he was the starter and played the entire season at Michigan. We didn't have any indication that he had any health problems at that point, did we?
No, okay. No, nothing there, nothing in the background. It is just, the back-to-back seasons, but a lot of leg injuries they're starting to stack up on top of each other. And as we know, it seems like when that happens.
The question is, it also means this is unfortunate to say, but I mean, it's my job as an analyst to say it. All that injury time is lost developmental time. Even though he's going to be a grad student in 2024, you can't say, oh, well, that means a bunch of incremental improvement, so he'll play like a grad student. You can't say that. He hasn't been playing all that. He's been gathering dust. I mean, not literally, but
right.
And it's yet to be, and even with all the tools that he had around him at Michigan, which was basically similar components to a team that went to the playoffs the next 2 years and won a national championship. All he was putting up was 140. And with what we're going to talk about for the rest of what, Iowa's offensive roster is for the pieces around him, without sugarcoating it or anything, it's not the pieces around him that Michigan had in 2021. So yeah, definitely a healthy Cade McNamara is definitely going to outperform any form of Deacon Hill. Well, I have no doubt about that. Okay. It's just that I don't even think that I would expect a 140 passer rating out of him. I think I'm just projecting forward. I'm still not expecting, even if Tim Lester is the greatest offensive coordinator in the world, which given the way things ended at Western Michigan, I kind of have doubts about that too. I have my doubts that this offense is going to really get much off the mat Do you think I'm wrong about that? What do you think?
Well, it depends on what your expectation level is. And that's, the back and forth that Hawkeye fans have at this point. Look, after what we've gone through the last few seasons and just how far this thing is cratered, even if this is a below average offense, a top 80 offense, you put them in 80th in yards per play or total offense, whatever metric you want to use. Tim Lester might have a statue outside of Kinnick Stadium if that happens. It is just, it's been that bad. And you look historically at the 25 years, there's been a couple of dynamic seasons offensively, but they're few and far between. This is a team built on defense, built on special teams, winning in the margins, doing all the little things. That's how they win football games, and they've been incredibly successful doing those kind of things. And because of that, marginal improvement and making them below average is a huge step up. If you didn't watch Iowa this year, just bless yourself, because you didn't have to watch that garbage offense, but they find ways to win these games in certain ways, and they get teams to play their style, and you don't know how they do it, but they do it time in and time out. And I think a lot says, you mentioned, there wasn't a whole lot of movement. There's guys that you say, is he ever going to play? But that's also the culture. There needs to be something said about Kirk Ferentz and building a culture. Guys want to stay there. They want to stick around. They want to put in their 4 or 5 years and do things. And it's just the way that things are built. It's different. It's certainly different today, in 2024 than it was even 10 years ago about roster building. But Kirk Ferentz deserves credit for the way that he's been able to do it, and year after year find a way to win football games.
Last question about quarterbacks. You indicated that you think they're going to still be looking in the portal during this offseason for a backup quarterback. I have no doubt about that, given that I think the status of the backup quarterback room and the need for one, given McNamara's health history, is pretty clear. Do you think that they would, in addition, be in the market for, do you think they're going to try to recruit in the transfer portal over McNamara? Do you think they're in the market for hey, we got to see if we can find somebody better than McNamara? Or do you think they're no, we're happy with McNamara and we just need to find him a backup?
I think at minimum, yeah, they are looking for a guy that will compete for the starting job. I think kind of the kids' gloves are off about that. Maybe he's not coming back healthy at the level that they hope, but the more and more people that I have talked to inside the program, that's what I continue to get. It's not just a stopgap. It's not just a guy to come in to be a backup. They are willing to go out there and find somebody at minimum that can compete with Cade McNamara, and maybe a guy that unseats him as a starting quarterback. So okay. I know talking to some people involved with the NIL collective, the Swarm collective is what it's called, that they're ready. They have the funds ready, and they know that it's going to take money to make it happen, and they're ready to go on that front.
Interesting. Oh, I have to keep our eyes open for that. Okay, running backs. Personnel-wise, not much to talk about here. I believe they're bringing back everybody. I don't think there's a single departure of a scholarship back or anybody who carried the ball for Iowa, right?
No. All back. There was a potential position change. Terrell Washington Jr. played a little bit last season, still maintained his red shirt, but did play in 4 games. He's been working a lot more in the slot receiver role. Played a little running back also during the open practice, but he's kind of, I guess, more of a hybrid type of guy. But everybody else is back. Big emergence out of LaShawn Williams last year. Kind of a disappointing year from Caleb Johnson, but yeah, all those guys will be back, and maybe one of the deeper running back rooms that Iowa's had in a long time.
Certainly a lot of them. Let me recite them. So LaShawn Williams got the most carries, 170 at 4.1 or 4.8 yards per carry. I didn't see him in the spring game. I gathered they were reserving him for injury or a minor ding kind of thing, but he should be, ready to go. He was the most productive back that I charted. I think he's pretty good. I am a little bit later. I'm going to talk about Iowa's run game, but I will just note here, and I'll get your opinion. To the extent that Iowa had difficulties in the rushing game, I don't think it had anything to do with the running backs, and certainly not LaShawn Williams. I think he's a pretty good running back. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely fair. Yeah, it was the offense as a whole, the offensive line really injured this past season. Yeah, that's definitely fair. That's the way that I'd put it. And LaShawn Williams is not dynamic. He had a long touchdown run against Wisconsin this past season, had a couple of long runs, but he is just a good, solid college running back.
No, and I think if the offensive line opens holes for him, if the offensive line does their job, then that guy's gonna get the 10 yards that the play is designed to get him.
Yep.
He's not going to make a mistake. He's not going to, oops, I ran through the wrong hole. Oops, I fell down because a stout breeze knocked me over. He's a good running back. I think I know what you're talking about with Caleb Johnson, who got the second most carries, like 117. He only got 40 yards a carry. I think he's got a little less wiggle to him, but I still think he's a fine running back. I don't have a lot of errors charted with him. I think you can go pretty far with him too. Frankly, I think that's true of like basically all these guys, Jason Patterson, and then the two true freshmen last year who both managed to retain their red shirts because they only played in 4 games, Kamari Moulton, and then the other guy, Terrell Washington, who you pointed out was also doing some of the receiving stuff. And then they also brought back a guy who was sort of a special teamers, but he got a few carries as well as a walk on Max White. And then they have 2 true freshmen in the room, Brevin Dahl and Xavier Williams. And then, like I said, no departures. So this is a pretty stacked room. I think everybody's pretty competent. Everybody's pretty solid. I don't know that they've got any real burners in the room. But the way that Iowa's offense is constructed, I don't really think that matters. So I think all systems are go for the running backs room.
One guy, we talked about Caleb Johnson and kind of a disappointing sophomore year. If you ever have a moment, go back and watch his touchdown run his freshman year against Nevada. It was that game that ended out like 2 a.m. our time because of there was a huge lightning delay and they delayed and came back and delayed again. So he had a touchdown in that one where it was one of the fastest running back runs of the season in college football 2 seasons ago. I can't remember offhand. It was like 24 miles an hour, something like that. Like he's a big dude too. He is kind of that power speed combination that he has. He wasn't healthy last season. I'm really hopeful, with this change in offense that he's a guy, just so many times he was stacked up at the line. He needs a little bit more space, but once he gets it, I think he's the most dynamic running back that they have. And I hope with a healthy season that he does become the starter. Like we said, Johnson, he's nice, solid. That's what you get. But I think Caleb has a chance to be the dynamic guy out of that group.
Okay, tight ends. So let me see if I can recite the history here. They were playing 4 guys last year primarily. That was informed by a couple of injuries. The primary guy was Eric All, who's a very talented dude. They got him from Michigan. He's a senior. He's been a mainstay for Iowa's offense for a long time. But he about halfway through the season, he got a knee injury, and then that was it. He was done. He was sitting out and getting ready for the NFL. Second guy that I saw, but then who sort of became the primary guy, was Addison Ostrenga. He's now an upperclassman. He was catching the ball the most with All's injury. He is back, although he was sitting out the spring game, so that's a little confusing. He was the only guy who didn't get hurt, and yet I didn't get to see him in the spring game. But he should be ready to go in the fall, right?
Yep, all good there health-wise. Really almost across the board. I was in really good shape coming out of spring practice. But yeah, I think Ostrenga showed enough that you saw him. He's also a true junior. Played a little bit as a freshman, had to play a lot more than anticipated last season. He's in good shape. All was out there. And remember, at the beginning of the season, they had Luke Lachey. He was injured, I think, the 3rd game of the year. And Lachey, he's a stud. He really is. He is going to be, I believe, your next big one.
Yeah, I agree, because he was the 4-star, but it was like the 3rd game of the season. It was like a pretty that wasn't a fun injury to watch. It was his ankle, and it was just like, oh my God, it was gross. Yeah, I think he could be really good, and I did get to see him in the spring game. He was playing the nub tight end with the ones, and I think he can be really good. He's going to be a senior this year, so he's definitely got a job. Even though he only played 3 games last year, he had the 3rd most yards of any tight end, only playing 3 games. So okay, definitely him. Now here's where it gets confusing. The 4th guy was he was an FCS guy who was unrated at high school. That was Steven Stiliano. He graduated. He ran out of eligibility. He played in all 13 games. The weird thing was that he was the 4th guy, because it meant that there were a bunch of dudes on scholarship. Iowa's got 12 tight ends on scholarship. The fact that he was the 4th guy and not a bunch of these other guys is sort of when I intimated earlier that I think there's a little bit of dead weight on the roster, this is one of the areas. So now, again, to reiterate, there are 4 guys that they were playing. 2 of them come back, Ostrenga and Lachey, although we didn't get to see much out of Lachey because he was injured in the 3rd game. And the 2 guys who depart are Eric All and Steven Stilianos. The guys that I was seeing in the spring game, Ostrenga was sitting out because I think of a minor ding. I was seeing Lachey, of course, because God bless him, he's healthy now. The other 3 guys that I was seeing were Zach Ortworth, who's a sophomore now. He was a true freshman who was playing a little bit last year, so that was interesting. I was seeing Hayden Large, who was the guy who came from an NAIA school, Dordt college who's playing like fullback a little bit, right? So I was seeing him play a lot with the twos. I was seeing a walk-on who was playing a bunch of special teams last year, number 82, Pescuzzi, right? I was seeing him play a ton in the spring game with the twos. And the two guys who I have not seen like at all ever since they arrived at Iowa are two guys on scholarship, but like literally have never seen them on the field, are Cale Vanderbush and Grant Leaper. And what's the deal with those guys?
You know, to be honest, we've heard nothing. And when you talk about the dead weight of the roster, those are definitely two guys that you're looking at and seeing, is it going to click? Yeah, Iowa plays a lot of tight ends, but you're not cracking rotation. You're not turning any eyes. Leaper of the two maybe has the better chance of becoming at minimum a rotational piece, but that would be, those are two guys that I think there's definitely some big time concern with both of them if they're ever going to be able to do anything. You know, a positions change, could that be in the future? That doesn't appear overly likely there. So, yeah, it's kind of scary when you're getting this deep into your career now, and there hasn't even been that little nugget, or you have the convert. Well, he's turned heads every once. No, I haven't heard any of that from either of those two guys.
Okay, good info. So, okay, predicting what we're going to see, Ostrenga, Lachey, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect we'll see, simply because we saw him a bunch, Ortworth and Large. And I think that's it. I think that's the rotation. And furthermore, I think we're going to continue to see lots of 12 personnel, like we were talking about at the top of the podcast. And it's going to be those four guys. And then I think that Pescuzzi was just sort of coming in because they needed a fourth guy in the spring game because Ostrenga was sitting it out. And I think that's it. So Ostrenga, Lachey, Ortworth, Large, and those are your four guys.
Yeah. Pacuzzi would be the other one. He'd be maybe the fifth on that one. In fact, he might be ahead of Large out of that group.
Oh, really?
But I will tell you, and Luke Lachey is going to have if he's healthy, he's going to have a monster year. He's going to be the next NFL draft pick with his athleticism, his speed, plus with the size that he has. He's probably going to be maybe a first rounder, but I think second, third round is no doubt about it with a healthy season. He's that special. Remember also the guy that he was going up against. They were going two tight ends before, and they had Sam Laporta had a pretty good rookie season with the Lions, and that's who he was behind the last couple of seasons. So he is dynamic. He is athletic. He has size. I've heard great things the way that he's practiced since he's been back this spring. So you're looking for that next great Iowa tight end. Definitely going to be Luke Lachey.
Okay, wide receivers. So departures first. Nick Raggiani, the guy who come in from Notre Dame a little while ago, ran out of eligibility. He was the technically leading receiver. Also, Deontay Vines transferred out. He, I think, was third or fourth on the list. Like the tight ends were getting most of the catches. So, and then also they had another wide receiver who I don't think got any catches. Jacob Bostic also transferred out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's it for the departures of note. Unless I missed anybody.
Nope, that looks like you have it. Yep.
So they bring back Seth Anderson, who came in from the FCS a little while ago, although he was injured, dinged up in the spring game. And so I didn't see him, but I think he will be good to go in the fall, right?
Yep. He'll be good to go. And looks like he'll be ready. Everything health-wise, at least at the wide receiver position, looks good.
Okay. The two... I was primarily, like I said, in the spring game, I was still seeing this personnel-wise, a similar 12 personnel offense as I have been seeing for Iowa for years and years. For the ones, I was seeing Caden Wetjen, who was the unrated JUCO that I had seen playing for Iowa last year. And then the guy that I hadn't seen before was number 84, Jarriett Buey. He was a true freshman last year, so this was like the first time I'd ever seen him. He's like 6'1". He's built like an outside receiver, and sure enough, he was playing outside receiver. I sort of expect that Buey, when Anderson is ready to play in the fall, I expect the Buey sits down, be Anderson and Wetjen, right?
Well, yeah, definitely with Buey. I mean, he's the guy out of the kind of young wide receivers that has the most hope, the most promise. He was on the travel team right away last year. So he was out there, though he maintained his redshirt status. He was still out there, and he was part of the rotation, and a guy that I think has a chance out of that young group. You mentioned Wetjen. He is the fastest guy out of the wide receiver group. I mean, you see this little white guy walk on, what's this? He is super fast, really dynamic. They used him a lot in jet sweep motion a year ago and doing those kind of things with him. And then Seth Anderson, so weird.
I mean, that's the thing, is every one of the wide receivers has about a third of their touches are wide receiver sweeps.
Right.
In fact, Wetchin, all of his touches are sweep. He doesn't have a
Right.
single catch.
It's so weird. And it's
But in the spring game, he was playing X, Z, he was actually catching passes. So, I sort of expect that continues. The thing is that with the twos in the spring game, I was seeing Dayton Howard and Alex Wick. Wick's a walk-on and Howard's another. He was a true freshman last year. He's the tallest one of the group. He's 6'4", but I really think it's going to be Wetchin and Anderson on the outside. And then, that's it. They're sort of other than Alex Moda, they're out of receivers.
And Moda is the guy that probably had the biggest injury. And,
did he?
Maybe, yeah. So he had one of the little scooter. Yeah, he had the little scooter thing with him on the sidelines on Saturday. So he had that part of it. So that's a guy that probably knocked down on the pecking order a little bit more. I think Anderson's the guy that you're most hopeful for. We saw him second play from scrimmage last year. Iowa, they actually threw a touchdown. Oh, here it is. I got a quarterback and we got a new wide receiver coming in. And then we just never really heard from Anderson much after that. He had a drop about midway through the season, saw his snaps start to go down a little bit. But, hey, it's Flipper Anderson's son. We're hopeful maybe that there's something there. It was just kind of a weird season the way the offense cratered. But, yeah, I think there's some hope that Anderson, he's got to add size. He's really skinny. He's got to add some weight here and still get bigger. But, yeah, Seth Anderson on the outside, that's kind of the guy you're hopeful for. And we talked about Bowie, too. Howard's intriguing, but it's also, I guess, a bit concerning. He's a kid from Kansas City. Kansas State, Kansas, Missouri, none of those programs offered him. That's kind of concerning when you have a wide receiver right in their backyard, and none of them gave him a scholarship offer.
Well, everything's up to date in Kansas City. You have to expect that they knew about him.
Right.
So you mentioned that the most talented guy in the room is Caleb Brown. I definitely agree with that. So does 247. He was a mid, almost high 4-star. He's interesting. He was like a running back in high school. I still, when I was watching him play, I definitely got the impression that he was still sort of learning the position. And yet, from charting these guys' plays, I can calculate their individual per play success rate. He's the most effective player on the team. And yet I can pinpoint where the problem with Iowa's offense is, because he's a slot receiver. He gets rotated off the field when Iowa goes to 12 personnel. And guess what? They're in 12 personnel 86% of the time.
Right.
The guy, he's an excellent wide receiver when he's on the field. He's just never on the field. And that's why I started out asking you, and I was asking you about Tim Lester and maybe changing up the offense to go to 11 personnel. And then I turn on the spring game and it's nothing but 12 personnel. And I'm like, guys, you're just going to squander Caleb Brown again. What do you think about that?
I think he will be out there and probably B or Z. I think if they go with the X, I think it's going to be your two wide receivers that are going to get the most snaps this year will be Brown and Anderson. I think those are going to be the two guys you see out there the most. Yeah. Caleb Brown, super dynamic. You mentioned him, former running back. This is a guy that played 4 games his freshman season at Ohio State in 2022 in that wide receiver room, as deep a wide receiver room as maybe we've ever seen. And they wanted to maintain his redshirt status, yet he still played in that rotation while learning the position. He's dynamic. I think he's going to be their best receiver, and he'll be on the field. And if they go 3 wide receiver, he'll be in the slot. I'm going to guess a lot of those times. Yeah. But when they are at 12 personnel, he's going to be out there probably at the Z position. I think you're going to see a ton of him out there. And like I said, I think they know what they have there with Caleb Brown. I would hope that Tim Lester doesn't screw this up.
I mean, that's what I would hope too. It's just that's not what I was seeing in the spring game. What I was seeing was him. I was seeing the same things I was seeing last year, which is Brown was reserved to be the slot receiver, not either of the flanker positions, and he didn't come in until they went to 11. What makes you say that you think they're going to switch him over and play Z?
Just because I'm hopeful more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally adopt the same stance if I were. I mean, I would too. I think it would be the logical thing to do, to be honest. Yeah. But I don't know, much of Iowa's offense doesn't strike me super logical. I don't know, man.
Very true, unfortunately.
Let's talk about this offensive line. I think This was the biggest surprise to me in charting Iowa's games for the last 3 years, was that I think I was expecting better offensive line play, and I was sort of surprised that for guys that were starters for as long as they were, and like it's super stable. I mean, they're bringing back everybody. It's a super senior. I mean, like everyone. I mean, it's senior, grad student, senior, junior, senior. Everyone. They've been there forever. I was expecting these guys to be absolute maulers who were just totally opening up like massive holes in the run game. And I wasn't really seeing it. Do you think I'm off base there, or what do you think about these guys?
It was an improvement this past season from what it was in 2022, but it was still bad. And I think a big reason for that, Mason Richmond played all season long, and he was pretty good his sophomore campaign. He took a huge step back last year, but he was banged up. And talking to some people inside the program,
I didn't know that.
He was really
playing
really
through an injury all of last year.
Yeah, it was one of those things. Never got official word of what it was. I just heard that somebody told me most every offensive lineman on their roster wouldn't even be playing through this, but they didn't have really anywhere else to turn, anything they were confident, and he just gutted it out and grinded it out. So the hope is that we see him reemerge at that left tackle position. Like I said, he was pretty good as a sophomore, huge step back this last season. Connor Colby's another guy, pretty highly regarded coming out of high school. We learned very quickly he was starting as a freshman at tackle. He's not a tackle, but he's a pretty good guard overall, and a guy that they absolutely love. And maybe you can help me out here because I just have not been able to see it. Is their center Logan Jones? They moved him over from D tackle to center, just like they did with Tyler Linderbaum. All right, he took over for Linderbaum, a first-round pick by the Ravens. He's going to be the same thing. And 2 years in, I don't see it. When Ellsbury's been in there, when he's been banged up, I think Ellsbury is the superior guy at the center position. I don't know. My eyes, I am not deep into, film analysis and the like. I just don't get it with the guy.
I think you're 100% correct because we saw it. He played like partway through the Northwestern game. Jones got absolutely humiliated by a Northwestern tackle. Like it was so bad he got turned around, was blocking his own guy. And they pulled him after that snap and they put Ellsbury in. And Ellsbury finished the game. And then later he wound up starting and playing the entire game against Nebraska last year. And I was just like, Ellsbury's grades are so much better than I don't understand what they're doing with Jones. I don't. Man. Anyway, let me do the recitation. I should have started with it. Last year, what I was seeing was Mason Richmond, left tackle, Nick Jong he started out at left guard. He played a little bit of right guard, one game of right tackle, but like halfway through the season, he got injured and he had to be replaced by Rusty Feth, who was the guy who came in from Miami of Ohio. Although even at that spot, Feth was rotating a little bit with Bo Stevens. So a lot of motion at that spot. Logan Jones was the center, although like we talked about, like there was a little bit of rotation with Tyler Ellsbury. Right guard was Connor Colby. And then the right tackle, who I believe played every game, was Jennings Dunker. And then I already mentioned like the backups that I saw. Rusty Feth, who came in, played left guard. Bo Stevens, who rotated, was like the third stringer, but they needed him at guard. And then Ellsbury, who's the backup center. So I saw 8 different guys. I believe that 7 of those guys are returning for 2024, and that Feth, the second string guard, is the only guy who's run out of eligibility. Do I have that right?
Yep. Feth moved on. He was just a one-year guy from Miami of Ohio. So everybody's back. Bo Stevens is a guy you talked about a little bit. Stevens was also really banged up last season. He had started a couple of games the year before. So he was one of the starters at the guard position, maybe the heir apparent. And they did bring in somebody this past weekend, kid from
the FCS, North Dakota, right? Borud.
Yes, Cade Borud, who played Southeast Polk, 3-time state champion. Kid has the biggest legs that I can remember seeing at a high school football player here in the state of Iowa. He is just a thick mauler. He was a freshman All-American last year. Maybe he's an interior guy, no doubt. He's a guard or a center, but maybe that's something that they think he can come in. He was willing to come in. He had scholarship offers from other programs in the FBS, but he was willing to walk on as they kind of figure out that scholarship situation we talked about earlier. So that's definitely another guy you got to throw into the mix.
Yeah, he came in. It was just a day or two ago. So after
Yep.
they played, they finished up spring practices. So we haven't seen him yet, nor did he figure into the spring competition. So we'll have to keep our eye on that for the fall. And like I said, I've been charting these guys for a while. If they're logical, they'll open this up to competition because I didn't. I mean, like I said, I wasn't super impressed. I mean, that's the thing. Just to get into I think everybody knows that Iowa's offense was not exactly the bee's knees, but I think a lot of people sort of just blame it all on the passing game. Which, look, yeah, the passing game is super problematic, right? Like, they're only 37%. Like, their success rate, as I chart, it's only 37%. That's real bad. They're only gaining, about 5 yards per pass attempt. That's really bad. They only have 8.7% of their passes attempted gain 15 plus yards. That's one of the worst numbers I've ever seen. So yes, the passing offense is super bad, and these numbers are consistent, for the last 3 years. In fact, they get worse each year. But the thing that's sort of shocking that people may not be aware of is the run game is not a lot better. They're only about 43.5% efficient in the run game. And where that really comes down to is that they're not bad in short. Actually, they're very good in short yardage situations, like second and short, third and short. And a lot of that has to do with quarterback sneaks, actually. Like Deacon Hill, for all of his problems, he's built like a fullback,
Yeah.
In fact, if Cade McNamara is not exactly up to 100%, you should just bring in Deacon Hill and have him do it. But anyway, not just 2023, but all of the last 3 years, it's this big, they can, if they need 3 yards, they can get 3 yards, but all they're getting is 3 yards. And on 1st and 10, they're only winning on 1st and 10 when they run the ball about 42% of the time, which is bad. That's way, way, way below average. And for a team that signals that they're running the ball, you can't do that. And the reason why I talked about with the running backs that I don't think the problem is the running backs is because I wanted to set up the discussion for the offensive line. I think it's the offensive line's fault.
Mm-hmm.
I really think actually almost all of Iowa's problems start with the offensive line's not good enough to operate this type of offense. And so they either needed to change the offense, which they can't do because the way that they use their roster management tools, or they need to change up the offensive line, but they're not going to do that because they're all seniors. And so that's, when I was I got bad news for you, I don't really see this getting off the mat. That was why. Okay, I've been talking and saying bad news. Do you think, do you want to push back? Do you have a different take? What do you think?
Well, I mentioned Richmond. I think that's a huge part of it. And another reason people were very excited with the Caden Proctor announcement when he was leaving Alabama and he came to Iowa City and then he stuck around for a couple of weeks and decided he was going to transfer back to Alabama was because of that shuffling of the line. All of a sudden, Mason Richmond's no longer your left tackle. Now he's probably going to be your right guard. And now you have returning starters there. You got Dunker out at right tackle, who was, I thought, okay at minimum his first season. He's lost 20 pounds, looks to be much quicker out there. So that's something that you get excited about. Well, that's not happening. So you're kind of going back to the old thing. You're exactly right, though. This offensive line, we can complain about Brian Ferentz and his ineptitude, and there are thousands of examples about just what an idiotic play caller and just developer of an offensive system. He's not a coordinator. He could be a great offensive line coach. He doesn't know how to coordinate an offense, and we certainly saw that play out. The quarterback play has been atrocious, going back to Spencer Petras and what we've seen for 3 years of his garbage at the quarterback spot, and then a banged-up Cade McNamara before we saw Deacon Hill a season ago. It's been bad, but put all those things together, it doesn't matter if you can't block, and you're bringing back all these guys back. They better be healthy, and they better be a lot better, because if that doesn't change, it's going to be bad offensively again this year.
Yeah. Just to wrap up, in the spring game, I believe that Logan Jones and Jennings Dunker were both dinged up and being held out, and that's why I was seeing Bo Stevens and Tyler Ellsbury. Ellsbury was at center. Stevens came in at left guard, and that bumped DeJong around to right tackle to fill in for Dunker. But I am thinking that Jones and Dunker are going to be healthy again in the fall and get their starting spots back, even though I think you and I both think that Ellsbury should be the starting center.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you'll see game one, health, and it looks like those guys, it was just kind of precautionary. They played a lot of snaps. Don't need to have them out there. It'll be, at left tackle, it'll be Richmond. You go inside, and we'll see exactly what they do there. Dunker will be your right tackle. Jones will be in the middle. It'll be Connor Colby at one of the guard spots, and then do they go with one of the younger guys? One guy they're really excited about, he's still not real big, is Cade Pieper, who comes in.
Mm-hmm.
He's just a redshirt freshman. He traveled last year. He showed up on the two deeps at 255 pounds a year ago. They're really excited about him. Is he going to be able to add enough size to be there? Stevens has got a chance to be there. And maybe even Ellsbury. Do they just decide, to make him a guard this season, or Jones a guard, and keep Ellsbury there? So there's still some fluctuation. Here's the thing that drives me crazy every single year, though. Kirk Ferentz, he's an offensive line coach. That's where his background is. That's what he was when he started his career 45 years ago as a grad assistant at Iowa and in the NFL for a long time. He's an offensive line guy. And that guy loves to tinker. When we get into October, we still don't know what the offensive line is. I hate it, but that's what he loves to do.
Well, I guess we'll keep our eye on it. I think the board is probably a decent addition. They have plenty. I mean, they certainly have plenty of depth.
Mm-hmm.
We saw 7 playable guys that they returned from last year. Plus they have boarded. It is pretty young past that group. It's a bunch of 2020, all the second unit that I was seeing in the spring game. It was all 2023 guys plus a walk-on, or I guess Dotzler is a 2022 guy, but that's with 2 dudes out. So understandable. It's definitely plenty of depth. They, I think, handle an injury or 2 injuries during the season without dipping from nominal play. The question for me is just is that play going to be any better than last year? I really think that that's the fundamental thing. Well, we've already talked about it. Let's switch over and talk about the defense.
All right. Now we're talking.
Speaking of guys who need a statue, Phil Parker. I don't know how Iowa's been able to hang on to this guy. Every team in America needs a coordinator who's as good as Phil Parker. Jesus Christ, man. And really not lose. I mean, there are 3 significant departures here, but only 3. Otherwise, they're bringing back everybody from a pretty top quality unit. Much has been made of the fact that when they play really top quality offenses, those top quality offenses score points on them. But first of all, they don't play that many of them in the Big Ten. Should be said.
Yeah.
And I kind of think it has to do with the way they play the secondary, which I don't want to talk about until we get to the secondary. Let's do the defensive front first.
All right.
It is at core a 4-3 defense in which the Sam plays out wide. They, a couple of years ago, finally implemented a nickel defense, but all really is the nickel just comes in from the Sam is just a bit lighter of the way that they play their outside. It's a little confusing because in their official nomenclature, they refer to the Sam as an outside linebacker, which is really confusing for anybody who's used to a 3-down defense, in which an OLB refers to somebody completely different. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The Sam is just, he's a linebacker who plays at depth. He's just way outside the box because he's just a stouter nickel. Anyway, defensive front, they were rotating basically 4 guys, or maybe if you want to think about it as 3.5 guys at the 2 tackle spots. Those guys were Yaya Black, Aaron Graves, Logan Lee, and then the half guy was Jeremiah Pittman. I actually didn't understand why I saw so little of Pittman. Do you know why that was?
Don't either. It kind of felt like he maybe fell out of favor a little bit, one of those kind of things, because I was with you. I thought we would see more snaps. I thought we saw some glimpses the year previous that he was going to be a bigger part of the rotation last season, and it just didn't happen. I think they were also, Logan Lee just hardly ever left the field. He just, just your prototypical hardworking, lunch pail kind of Iowa defensive lineman. Mm-hmm. Right spot every single time, occupy space, occupy blockers. It's not fun, but he did it well. And a guy that I thought really emerged last year was Y.A. Black. Y.A. Black, huge dude. I mean, he's just a mountain of a man. And he injured his shoulder in the Wisconsin game. There was a little bit of concern right afterwards. I talked to one person that thought maybe his season was going to be over. It wasn't. He kept playing. And I think his level even went to a higher level with a pretty major shoulder surgery. Got that cleaned up in the offseason. He is a stud. Graves is a guy we've been waiting for. Played 8-man football here in the state of Iowa. He was an Army All-American coming out of high school. Got to play down in San Antonio. And we've seen the glimpses. We just haven't seen the consistency. Losing Logan Lee, though, Aaron Graves, he's got to take a big step forward this season, because after those 3 guys, that's probably another spot we're talking about if they would go shopping in the portal. another defensive tackle would probably be on that wish list.
Yeah, I am a little curious about that. So Lee has moved on. I've no doubt he's going to try for the NFL.
Yep.
They lose another couple of guys. Terrio Thompson transferred out. He got a little bit of run last year, not too significant. And then Chris Reams graduated. He, again, I think got like one game in.
Yeah.
That's it. But I don't think they added anybody. I'm not sure that any of the 4 freshmen that they took are, well, I'm certain that none of the 4 freshmen that they took are going to play. So it doesn't, we'll find out who's going to be an end and who's going to be a tackle later. But they haven't taken anybody, at least not yet, through the portal. And so of the 4 guys that they were playing in the rotation at the 2 tackle spots, the other 3, Lee leaves, but the other 3 return: Black, Graves, and Pittman. In the spring game, Black was sitting out, but I saw Graves and Pittman. They both looked fine. I think it probably would have been nice if they played Pittman a little more in 2023, given that they knew this was going to happen in 2024, but whatever. But then what was interesting was, I think you're right. I think behind, like, what happens if somebody gets hurt? First of all, it would be nice to have 4 guys. I don't know that they have 4 guys. And second of all, what if somebody gets hurt? I don't know that they have a 5th guy, because the other 2 guys that I were seeing was Jeff Bowie, who I hadn't seen at all before. And the other guy that I was seeing was Will Hubert, who I think is a walk-on. I haven't seen at all Chase Brackney ever, not in the spring game, not before. I haven't seen, this is the best name I've ever seen before from an Iowa player, Maddox Bocherding Johnson. Never seen that. I mean, he was a true freshman last year, so that's not surprising, but it was surprising I didn't see him in the spring game. And then I believe the only other defensive tackle that they've got is Griffin Little, who is a converted offensive lineman. And like, those guys never work out the first year after you convert them. Like maybe after he's done it for a year, he'll be decent the next year, but like, it just takes him forever to get the technique right. And I'm like, who's the 4th guy? Who's the 5th guy? I don't know, man. This is like ripe to take a portal dude, except I don't know if you've been paying attention to the transfer portal. There is a massive bidding war going on right now for transfer portal defensive tackles. Like, it's maybe other than quarterback, it's maybe the most in-demand position that there is. I kind of think there might be a sort of a depth issue here. What do you think I'm out on a limb? What do you think?
No, absolutely. I'm right there with you. Kind of that young group you talked about, or younger group, I think Bowie would be the guy that maybe would be 4th out of that group.
Oh, yeah. I would definitely pencil him as the 4th guy. It's just, it's weird that he came in 2021 and I've never seen him.
A younger guy I know they're excited about, he's a walk-on, is Ryan Kennan. Now, he went there and he was walking on to be a long snapper. And showed up, went through all the different things. And Kennan, he is a really good defensive lineman right where I live in West Des Moines at Valley High School. But, big, all right, he can snap the ball. Let's see what happens there. He showed up in a couple of the scholarship guys in his class. He's already out playing. Now, they gray shirted him last year, so he is considered a true freshman for this upcoming season. He's not ready now. In fact, he probably won't be ready for another 2 years to add the size. But that's one to maybe put in your back pocket is Ryan Kennan when you're kind of looking at a guy down the line. But no, you're right. The depth is really concerning at defensive tackle. And I think the likelihood is you would see them just go small. And it could be a guy like a Max Llewellyn. It could be even the Ethan Hurkhead. He's played inside on passing downs a little bit. That's probably the direction they'd eventually go if it got to that spot where they had a couple injuries at D-tackle.
That's an interesting story. I will keep an eye on that one. Okay, well, and we'll keep our eye on the transfer portal because, or if they just go with a smaller rotation. But potentially that's a thing to watch out for, because it's a way that teams that are really reliant on their defense to do everything for them sometimes get themselves in trouble if they don't have enough depth at defensive tackle. And on the other hand, I think they're in pretty good shape. They do lose one guy, Joe Evans, who was very productive for them, despite being a walk-on, right? He was originally a walk-on.
He was. Yep.
He was one of the 4 guys in the rotation. The other 3 come back, but unlike with the defensive tackle, it was a pretty even rotation. The other 3 are Deontay Craig, Ethan Herkett, and Max Llewellyn. I was seeing all three of those guys in the spring game. I also saw with the twos, Brian Allen, who I saw a little bit last year, Caden Crawford and Kenneth Merriweather. I didn't see Crawford and Merriweather play at all last year, but Allen I saw in a couple of games. I think the depth here is pretty good. Not the depth isn't super experienced, but the three returners are super experienced. I'm sure, given the level of development here, that they'll probably do just fine placing, Evans. If you had to guess, who do you think will be the new fourth guy in the rotation?
It's a great unknown. I'm a big fan of Allen. Now, it's that funny thing where we just get the glimpses, right? Last year, spring practice, the open practice, he was great. August camp, the one open practice that we get, he was great. And then we were so surprised that at minimum he wasn't part of the rotation a year ago. Same thing in the spring game this year. He showed up again. You can really see it there. Now, Iowa is very specific about the way you have to play on the defensive line. Hand placement, knowing your steps, all those different things. The boring things that are not real fun to talk about on podcasts and to go through, they're ultra important for Iowa football. The way that they play and how year after year this model is so sustainable is because they drill those little things. I would anticipate, it's just a guess, but that is probably the thing with Brian Allen is maybe he likes to do his own thing a little bit too much, as it pertains to trying to get to the quarterback, those kind of things. That would be my guess, but it's just that because talent-wise, making plays when he's out there, it seems like he does it every single time. Talent-wise, he is way up there, but that'd be the guy I'd definitely put forth in that group.
Okay. Linebackers. Well, just like the running backs, I don't think there's any departures here. Not of scholarship players or guys who played for him last year. They return both the Will and the Mike, Jackson and Jay Higgins. They also return the guy I was seeing at Sam Kyler Fisher, although I think he was held out of the spring game on a minor ding. They were playing Jackson Rexroth in the spring game at Sam, although behind him, I think they had a walk-on with the twos, Kelby Talander. There wasn't a ton of rotation here during the 2023 season. I saw a bit of Carson Sherrar, who's playing Will with the twos. I saw a bit of Jaden Harrell play Mike. They bring back a whole lot of scholarship guys who I just haven't really seen much of. Ben Coiter, Zach Twett, Aiden Hall, Landon Van Kekerix, Jaden Montgomery. I mean, it's a long list of dudes. It's just that they bring back their starters, and I have no reason to think that they're not going to that they're going to do anything other than play their starters. So that's that. Is there anything to talk about here?
No, it's going to be Jay Higgins make a ton of tackles like he did a season ago. Nick Jackson, if you saw him last year towards the beginning of the year, he comes in, he's a transfer from Virginia. They beat Oklahoma for him. You're really excited, and you just didn't see it in September. He talked about this as the year went on. Learning the complexities of the Iowa defensive system, it took him a while. He was a middle linebacker at Virginia, and he had to move then over, though it's also an inside linebacker in the Iowa scheme. It was a different spot for him. He really came on, though, in October, November, played some great football. He said this spring he feels like he is learning more and more every single day. He's an incredibly heady player. He's got good numbers. In fact, he's got a chance to set the all-time record in terms of tackles for a career in FBS football coming up this season. Him and Higgins are outstanding. A couple of the young guys he mentioned, Jade Harrell, he could transfer to, I don't know, probably 70 programs to be a starting middle linebacker. He's that good. But he's just willing, an Iowa kid, to stay behind the culture that we talked about earlier. That's a big part of it. He was in on the goal line stand a year ago in Wrigley Field against Northwestern. He was in there as they brought in an excellent linebacker. He played really well in his limited snaps. So they have depth there. They have guys that are excited. You mentioned Shire. He's a guy that has never been able to stay healthy, but in terms of athleticism, people talk about a Chad Greenway type when they talk about him and his speed that he has. So they brought in a ton of these guys. They're also a huge part of the special teams. It's just kind of the type of guy that you can get in Iowa. That's why they have so many of them. But you're right. Talking about those guys. Also got to mention Ben Keeter. Ben Keeter is a world champion wrestler. He wrestled a couple of matches this year, heavyweight for Iowa. I do wonder down the road if he's going to try to play football and wrestling all the way through his collegiate career. If maybe he becomes a defensive lineman, a defensive end, he was able to bulk up, get a little bit bigger, and not have to worry about all the things that you have to know as a linebacker. keep it simple. Learn a couple of pass rush moves and go that direction. If that's what we see down the line, Peter.
Well, it is interesting because all three of the guys that I expect to be the starters, Higgins, Jackson, Fisher, are all grad students, I believe on their last year of eligibility. So it will be interesting to see if maybe they get a little more rotation this year. It makes sense why they're carrying so many scholarship guys and why they're so young in the rest of the room. It's like they're going to lose their three starters, next year. So it will sort of be interesting to watch how they do the playing time rotation here, because they got to train up the next round. Secondary. Let's start with the safeties. I don't think there's any meaningful departures here. They lose one guy, Brendan Des Fernandez, but he didn't really. I think it was primarily a special teamer.
He was.
They return. They return the field safety, Sebastian Castro. They return the boundary safety, Quinn Schulte. They returned the sort of the nickelback / boundary safety, the Xavier Nwankpa. He was the guy who would rotate on and off. It was actually interesting. They sort of they'd switch up, it's not a straight substitution for the Sam for the nickelback. They'd spin a guy down. But at any rate, those three guys all returned. They got virtually every one of the snaps. I don't know, man. They've got a couple other, backups returning, although I didn't really see much of them. I think there were a few guys who were missing due to injuries in the spring game here. But like I said, they bring back Castro, Schulte, and Nwankpa, sort of end of story, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's the way you look at it. So Castro plays what they call their cash position. It's the nickelback position. Right. And Castro, I know
he's not the guy who rotates off the field when they when they go to 4-3, he goes from the nickel up to be the field safety, and then Schulte switches over to be boundary, and then it's Nwankpa is the guy who comes off the field when they go to the 4-3, which is I think that's interesting. Yeah, it's not just like a straight substitution of Sam for nickel, but yeah.
I also maybe a reason for that last year. Xavier Nwankpa last year was playing with a pretty shoulder injury that showed up a couple of plays where you could see him not really laying his head in there. I called a bunch of his games in high school. I do our play-by-play for our radio game of the week, and Southeast Spoke, the program he played with, has been a 3-time state champion, so called a lot of his games. He covers as much ground as anybody I've ever seen at the high school level as a safety. I wonder what he's going to be if he's completely healthy this season. I think that shoulder injury was really debilitating to him last year. Now, they run with the cash out there on majority of their snaps. I think 2 years ago, it was something like 74% of the time they were in that system. And because Castro is, that oversized safety, if you will, you can kind of get away with that even against teams that run it a little bit more, and they're willing to do that. But I'll be interested to see if Nwankpa's healthy this year, kind of what they do, and when they are switching and they do go to the traditional 4-3, what does that mean if Nwankpa still comes off the field, or if that means Castro is going to come off?
What do you think of the depth here? It didn't wind up playing a role last year, but the only guys I was seeing play with the twos were Zach Lutmer, who's a redshirt freshman, and Cale Klarick, who's I think a walk-on. I wasn't seeing Ettinger, I wasn't seeing Tegan Davis, and I wasn't seeing I can't believe Iowa's got a Khalil Tate on the team. They're all very young. I haven't really seen them. Who do you think, if something happens to one of the starters, who do you think comes in?
I think Zach Lutmer is the guy, and Lutmer was brought up two different times by Phil Parker during the media availability here during the spring. It's a guy that I just didn't know a whole lot about, hadn't heard a whole bunch about, and it was kind of one of those eye-opening. Phil Parker, you see him, he's kind of a gruff guy. You hear him, he's a gruff guy. If he singles out a player a couple of different times like he did with Lutmer, you got something there. And so that's a guy without any background information outside of him just bringing up his name. That's the only thing. He would definitely be the guy that I would say would be the one to keep an eye on.
Okay, last position is cornerback. They lose Cooper DeJean, probably going to wind up being a first-round draft pick, although for my money, I think he's going to wind up playing safety in the NFL rather than corner. But at any rate, Iowa it looked like they had about 4 guys in the rotation at corner. DeJean was one of them. The 3 other guys that I saw were Jamari Harris, Deshaun Lee, and then TJ Hall. But Hall got hurt about halfway through the season. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and Hall actually, he only played 4 games, so he actually was able to redshirt last season.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, the official stats thing that I saw, or maybe unofficial, said 6, but you say 4? Well, I'll look into that. That's interesting. So that's okay. That is interesting. So then in the spring game, Harris was dinged up, so he sat out, but Lee and Hall were both available. Hall appears to be over whatever his injury was last year. And so I was like, okay, so the 1s will be Lee and Hall, and they'll dig up 2 other guys to be with the 2s. But that's not what I saw. It was Hall and Nestor with the 1s, like John Nestor, who I had like basically not seen at all last year. And Lee was with the 2s, even though he was like the cornerback who played like the 3rd most snaps last year. He was basically like another starter besides, Harris and DeJean. And I was like, am I watching Lee lose his job in the spring game here? Like, what was up with that?
It's really interesting. And speaking of what we said with Lutmer, same thing. John Nestor has come up a ton. And this goes back to camp leading up to the bowl game. During December camp, his name come up a ton. They absolutely love him. They think he is special. He's going to be the next Riley Moss. He's going to be the next Cooper DeJean. I mean, that's what we continue to hear about him. So they're enamored with him. They have Jamari Harris, who was suspended the first 2 games because of the gambling investigation. He sat out this spring. He'll be fine. Injury-wise, he's going to be okay. But, yeah, that's a big piece there. This is deep. I mean, I think they really do go 4 deep. TJ Hall's a guy that was highly regarded coming out of high school. He had a Michigan offer, Washington offer. Not very often Iowa even recruits in California. And to get TJ Hall, I think that's a good one. He's finally healthy. They're really excited. I think they are realistically 4 cornerbacks deep, something that just doesn't happen very often at Iowa.
So if you had to bet, are you telling me that you think that the 2 guys that they'll trot out, as the starters, first snap guys, are Nestor and Harris, and then Lee and Hall would be behind them?
I wouldn't be surprised by it. I would still, I guess, give Lee the nod, but it's going to be close. It's going to be close. This is going to be probably one of the most intriguing kind of position groups to look coming up in camp.
But it's those 4 guys at any rate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, that is very interesting. Well, I'm glad that you at least confirmed what I was seeing in the spring games. I almost couldn't believe my eyes. Okay. Well, I think that's all my questions.
I had one other I forgot to bring up in the safety is Cohen Entringer. So he was the guy, if you remember the Big Ten championship game on the big punt return by Michigan that missed the tackle and then came all the way back down the field and made the play, tracked down the punt returner from 40 yards behind the play. He was banged up a little bit this spring, but they have really, really high hopes for him. So when we're talking about the safety position, he's another guy, Entringer, you definitely got to put in the mix.
Okay, I didn't see him during the spring game, so but I hadn't seen any reports that he was injured. So I was like, "Oh, is he on the outs?" But he was injured. Okay, that makes sense of that then. Okay, thank you. Good tip. All right. So, but overall, even though, a couple of departures, couple questions about who replaces who. And then I think maybe tackle is a position where maybe they need a little bit of portal help, which may be hard coming. And so I don't know, man. I think basically I'm looking at the same sort of high quality defense last year. I don't really expect this to take. I mean, it would be difficult to repeat the same performance as they did last year because last year, was so excellent. But I don't know, man. I think this is going to be another pretty high quality defensive unit. They're just returning so much.
If they take a step back, they're still going to be a top 10 defense in college football and maybe even top 5. They're so good. The way that Phil Parker coaches the way that they're just in the right spot. It's as much as it pains to watch that Iowa offense. If you really watch the Iowa defense, it's just so well coached. It's so fun to watch, watching just those little details that they're so good about. And the depth is definitely there. I think they're ready-made. I guess, another place you mentioned depth of defensive tackle. Could there be a rush end out there? Maybe you're looking at Deontay Craig had a disappointing year last year for his standards. He was another guy that played last season, and I think definitely him. He guy 2 years ago as a sophomore, I thought was on his way, maybe even to being an early entry into the NFL draft, and it definitely didn't play out this past season that way. But yeah, overall the defense, it's going to be elite once again this year. I'm right there with you.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about pulling out the down and distance analysis is that it is a defense that dares you to march down the field. Like they actually, in some ways, it's interesting because it's kind of like the mirror opposite of the offense, where they're actually not that good at defending second and short, third and short rushing. They actually will. They pretty much let you have like 3 yards in second and short, third and short, like pretty much automatically. It's just that's all they'll let you have. Like you're not gonna get 10 yards or 15 yards on those runs, but you can convert those. And the thing is, against most offenses, like there's no way that they're going to march down the field like Northwestern tried to, in that game. It was hilarious watching Northwestern try to march down the field 3 yards at a time with their quarterback who can't throw the ball. Like Iowa was letting it. Like I was like, fine, run the ball 3 yards at a time. But it like eventually you are eventually going to miss one of them, or you are eventually going to have to throw the ball. Like one of those two things, is not going to work out for you unless you're a really high quality, offense, which will either take you up on the deal and will just run the ball all day long, or they have a really elite passing offense. And the question, I think there is a question about whether or not the secondary is as elite as I mean, this is always the question with Big Ten teams, is like, is this defense as good as it looks, or are they just playing terrible offenses? And from watching Iowa all this time, like I definitely don't think it's an illusion. Like I definitely think there's a lot of it is totally for real. But I do think like the fact that they kind of get lit up by good passing offenses is sort of, I guess, I wonder if you have an opinion about this. I don't think this is the most athletic secondary in the world.
Nope.
Do you disagree with that?
No, not at all. Now, Cooper DeJean is one of the best athletes that ever walked through the University of Iowa. I mean, that kid, flip on his basketball highlights when he's drop step dunking on people at 6 foot tall, and you can see his athleticism. But yeah, overall, athleticism wise, that's not their calling card. They just know how to play. They know how to play football and be in the right spot, and it works more times than not.
Yeah, it's just if you look at the down and distance analysis, their third and long pass defense rate is 79%. Like it's amazing. Like when they know you have to pass, they are a fantastic pass defense with the dudes that they've got. On the other hand, when they're in situations when they don't know whether or not you're going to pass, like, second and medium, third and short, that sort of thing, like the pass defense collapses. Like it's a below average pass defense. Like that's the trick to beating Iowa's defense, is keep them guessing. Because like, I don't think the secondary is good enough athletes to just play anything. They have to put you in a position where they know what's coming. Because if they know what's coming, oh my God, Iowa will 1,000% shut you down. Like Phil Parker is so good. But yeah, and in that was the point of going through this whole roster, is that like, hey, it's basically the same roster as it was last year. So I think that, that same situation will obtain. All right, Trenton, it's been really good talking to you. Thank you for your time. Oregon and Iowa don't play each other this year. I was sort of kind of ashamed because I was looking forward to it. But who knows, with the way these things go down, maybe they'll see each other in Indianapolis.
I would not be shocked. The Iowa schedule, people talked a lot about, well, they don't have the nice cushion of the Big Ten West anymore. They don't, and they got to go to Ohio State. But outside of that, this is an incredibly manageable schedule again for Iowa this season. The two new teams, if you will, coming in. They get Washington, obviously a completely different look for the Huskies this season, coming to Kinnick Stadium. And then they go out to UCLA, and that will be there will be a good 30, 40,000 Hawkeye fans that are going to make that trip and make the trip to the Rose Bowl. It's going to be probably a home game for Iowa in that one. The schedule sets up incredibly well for Iowa to make another run this season, and I think, I know the numbers are out there, some different places where you can bet on it, The win total at 7.5, I think, is a joke. I think this team at minimum is going to be 9-3 this season, and maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, I definitely have. I'm pretty familiar with both Washington and UCLA and what they're bringing back. I definitely have Iowa penciled in as winning both of those games, and not even really breaking a sweat out of them either. Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Trenton, thanks a lot. It has been good talking to you, man.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Take care.